Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Warrior's Shadow. Derek Morrison had always been a man who measured life in absolutes. Black or white, loyal or treacherous, alive or dead. 22 years in Special Forces had carved these principles into his soul like scars on granite. As he sat in the transport plane heading back to Colorado Springs, the familiar weight of his duffel bag between his boots, Derek allowed himself a rare moment of anticipation. 15 months. That's how long he'd been gone, hunting shadows in places that didn't exist on maps, doing things that would never appear in official reports. The kind of work that kept America safe while Americans slept peacefully in their beds. The kind of work that had cost him 2 fingers on his left hand, a network of scars across his torso, and more sleepless nights than he cared to count. But it had also earned him something precious: early retirement at 38 with full benefits, and the promise of a normal life with Lindsay and their 8-year-old son, Tyler. The boy would be 9 now, Derek realized with a pang of guilt. He'd missed another birthday, another Christmas, another year of his son's childhood sacrificed on the altar of duty. Derek's phone buzzed. A text from his neighbor, Mrs. Chun. Derek tried calling Lindsay about Tyler. Worried. Call me when you land. Strange. Derek had tried calling Lindsay 3 times from Germany during his layover, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He'd assumed she was busy with Tyler's school activities or her part-time job at the veterinary clinic. Lindsay had always been independent, sometimes to a fault, but she usually answered his calls during deployment. The plane touched down at Peterson Air Force Base at 11:47 p.m. Derek's commanding officer, Colonel Raymond Torres, had arranged for him to process out quickly, a courtesy for a decorated veteran who'd given everything to his country. By 1:15 a.m., Derek was driving his stored Jeep through the empty streets of Colorado Springs, muscle memory guiding him toward the modest 2-story house on Maple Street that had been his anchor through years of deployment. The house was dark except for a single light in the upstairs window, Tyler's room. Derek smiled despite his exhaustion. The boy had always been a night owl, probably reading under his covers with a flashlight. Some things never changed. Derek parked in the driveway, noting that Lindsay's Honda wasn't there. Probably at her mother's house again. Patricia Kellerman had never approved of Derek's military career, viewing it as an abandonment of family responsibility. The woman had poisoned enough conversations over the years that Derek had learned to simply avoid her when possible. He used his key to enter quietly, not wanting to wake Tyler if the boy had finally fallen asleep. The house felt different somehow, cleaner but also colder. The family photos that used to line the hallway had been replaced with generic artwork. Derek's military commendations, once proudly displayed in the living room, were nowhere to be seen. A sound from upstairs made him freeze. Not Tyler's voice, but a man's laughter, followed by Lindsay's unmistakable giggle. The sound that had once made Derek's heart race now sent ice through his veins. Derek moved with the silent precision that had kept him alive in hostile territory. Each step on the stairs was carefully placed, avoiding the creaks he'd memorized years ago. The sounds grew clearer as he reached the landing. Intimate whispers, the rustle of sheets, the rhythmic creaking of his marriage bed. Through the crack in the bedroom door, Derek saw his wife of 12 years entwined with a man he didn't recognize, tall, soft-looking, with sandy hair and the kind of pale skin that spoke of office work and gym memberships rather than real labor. Lindsay's wedding ring sat on a nightstand next to a man's watch Derek didn't recognize. 22 years of training ward with 22 years of civilization. Derek's hand instinctively moved toward the knife he still carried out of habit, but something held him back. Not mercy. Derek Morrison had burned through his capacity for mercy long ago. But patience. The kind of patience that turned hunters into legends. He backed away, silently, his mind already calculating, planning, adapting. In the field, the first rule of engagement was intelligence gathering. Know your enemy. Know their weaknesses. Know their fears. Only then do you strike. Derek slipped into Tyler's room, expecting to find his son sleeping peacefully. Instead, he found an empty bed. The sheets were clean, The room too neat, like a museum display rather than a child's bedroom. Tyler's favorite stuffed elephant, a gift Derek had brought back from his second deployment, was nowhere to be seen. The ice in Derek's veins turned to liquid nitrogen. He checked the bathroom, the guest room, even the closets. No Tyler. No sign that the boy had been in this house recently. Derek's breathing remained controlled, but his pulse hammered with the rhythm of approaching battle. Back downstairs, Derek searched with methodical precision. In the kitchen, he found Tyler's school schedule stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet. According to the calendar, Tyler should have started third grade 2 weeks ago. But there were no lunch boxes, no backpack by the door, no childhood debris that accumulates around an 8-year-old like gravitational pull. Derek's phone buzzed again. "Mrs. Chun, Derek, please call. It's about Tyler. I'm worried." This time, Derek called. "Derek." Mrs. Chin's voice was thick with sleep and concern. "Thank God. I've been trying to reach Lindsay for 3 days. Tyler hasn't been to school. I saw some things through my window. I didn't know if I should call the police." "What did you see, Mrs. Chun?" 3 nights ago, during that terrible storm, I heard screaming. Tyler was outside in the rain, and Lindsay, she was yelling at him. Terrible things. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard her say." Mrs. Chin's voice dropped to a whisper. "She said he ruined her life, and there was a man with her. Not you." Derek's grip on the phone tightened until the plastic creaked. "Where is Tyler now?" "I don't know. I haven't seen him since that night." "Derek, I think something bad happened." Derek ended the call and stood in his kitchen, processing the information with the cold efficiency of a military briefing. His wife was cheating. His son was missing. And multiple someones, had betrayed the 2 things Derek held sacred: loyalty and family. In Afghanistan, Derek had once tracked an insurgent cell for 3 months before striking. He'd learned their routines, their relationships, their weaknesses. He'd discovered which of them had families, which had debts, which had secrets they'd kill to protect. When he finally moved, the entire cell had simply disappeared. No prisoners, no survivors, no mercy. Derek walked to the basement and opened a lockbox hidden behind the water heater. Inside were items that officially didn't exist. Untraceable phones, cash in multiple currencies, identification documents with names that had never been born. And most importantly, a leather journal filled with contact information for men who specialized in problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels. He selected a phone and dialed a number from memory. Garrett Security Consulting. The voice was gravelly, professional. "This is Morrison. I need a priority locate on a missing person. 8-year-old boy, last seen 3 days ago." Derek provided Tyler's description and details. "Understood. Full package." Derek's jaw tightened. Full package meant surveillance, background checks, and other services that operated in legal gray areas. "Yes, and I need a complete workup on 2 adults. Lindsay Morrison and an unknown male, mid-30s, sandy hair, approximately 6'2". Derek described the man he'd seen in his bed. Timeline, 24 hours. "That'll cost extra. Money is no object." Derek hung up and walked back upstairs. The sound from the bedroom had quieted. Through the crack in the door, he could see Lindsay and her lover sleeping peacefully, unaware that their world was about to end. Derek Morrison had spent his entire adult life protecting people who didn't deserve protection, killing enemies who didn't deserve mercy, and sacrificing everything for principles that meant nothing to the people who benefited from a sacrifice. But this was different. This was personal, and Derek Morrison was very, very good at making things personal. Chapter 2. The Mother's Venom. Derek didn't sleep. Instead, he sat in his Jeep parked 3 blocks away, watching his house through military-grade binoculars. At 6:23 a.m., a silver BMW pulled into his driveway. Derek recognized the car immediately. Patricia Kellerman, Lindsay's mother. The woman emerged wearing expensive workout clothes and the expression of someone attending a funeral she was secretly glad about. She let herself into the house with her own key, a detail Derek filed away with growing anger. Patricia had been given access to his home, his sanctuary, while he'd been bleeding for his country. Through the upstairs window, Derek watched shadows move. Conversations he couldn't hear but could imagine. 20 minutes later, Patricia emerged with Lindsay and the mystery man. Derek's wife wore sunglasses despite the overcast morning and moved with the nervous energy of someone expecting confrontation. Derek followed at a distance, his Jeep's modified engine purring quietly as they drove across town to Oakwood Heights, the kind of gated community where people like Patricia displayed their success like tribal markings. The BMW led them to a sprawling colonial house with perfectly manicured lawns and the sterile beauty of professional landscaping. Derek parked on a side street and activated the listening device he'd attached to Lindsay's car during the night. Military training had its advantages. Sure he didn't see anything? Patricia's voice crackled through the receiver. I told you, he was supposed to be gone for another month. Lindsay sounded defensive, scared. Brad, maybe we should. Relax. The male voice was confident, dismissive. Military guys are all the same. Predictable. He'll probably file for divorce and disappear into some veterans program. Derek smiled coldly. Predictable. That was their first mistake. What about Tyler? Lindsay's voice dropped to a whisper. What about him? Patricia's tone carried the kind of casual cruelty Derek had heard in interrogation rooms. The boy needed to learn his place. He was getting too comfortable, thinking he could disrupt our plans. Mom, you threw him outside during a storm. He's 8 years old. He's Derek's son, Patricia said, as if that explained everything. That man poisoned that child against us from day one, always filling his head with stories about honor and duty and other military nonsense. Tyler needed to understand that his loyalty should be to family, real family. Derek's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Through the receiver, he heard the sound of a door opening. Where's Tyler now? It was Brad's voice, moving closer to the device. Safe, Patricia replied. At my sister's place in Wyoming. Aunt Dorothy is understanding about difficult children. She'll keep him there until we figure out what to do long term. Derek had met Dorothy Kellerman once at his wedding, a bitter woman who ran a therapeutic ranch for troubled youth. One of those places where parents sent children they couldn't control. The kind of place that operated in the spaces between legal oversight and genuine care. And if Derek comes looking? Brad asked. He won't. Patricia's voice carried absolute certainty. Derek Morrison is a soldier, not a detective. He follows orders and shoots enemies. He doesn't think strategically about complex family situations. Wrong again. Derek's phone buzzed with a text from Garrett Security. Target located. Wyoming. Details attached. Also, your unknown male is Brad Henley, 34, insurance adjuster. Divorced, financial difficulties. More intel follows. Derek scrolled through the attached files. Dorothy Kellerman's ranch was 150 miles away, isolated in the kind of terrain where screams carried only as far as the wind. The place had been investigated twice for child welfare violations, but never shut down due to lack of evidence and well-placed political connections. Brad Henley's profile was equally illuminating. Divorced 18 months ago after his wife discovered his gambling addiction. Currently $60,000 in debt to people who didn't offer payment plans. He'd met Lindsay at the veterinary clinic where she worked. He'd brought in a dog that didn't belong to him, later revealed to be a pathetic attempt to meet women. But the most interesting detail was Brad's insurance background. He specialized in life insurance investigations, the kind of work that taught someone how to identify discrepancies, stage accidents, and identify the difference between natural death and suspicious circumstances. Derek's tactical mind began assembling a picture. Lindsay's affair hadn't been a momentary lapse. It had been a calculated decision. Brad wasn't just a lover. He was a conspirator. And Patricia wasn't just an overbearing mother-in-law. She was the architect of a plan that involved removing Derek from the equation entirely. They'd probably been waiting for news of Derek's death in combat. He realized. When that didn't happen, they'd move to Plan B, drive him away by destroying everything he cared about. They'd miscalculated badly. Derek drove to a military surplus store owned by a former Marine named Tommy Voss. Tommy asked no questions and kept no records for certain customers. Derek emerged with a duffel bag full of equipment that wasn't available to civilians, paid for with cash that couldn't be traced. Next stop was a storage unit Derek maintained under an assumed name. Inside were items he'd accumulated over 2 decades of operations: communications equipment, surveillance gear, and other tools of the trade. But most importantly, he retrieved a slim file containing detailed background information on every member of Lindsay's family. Intelligence he'd gathered years ago when evaluating potential security risks. Patricia Kellerman wasn't just wealthy, she was connected. Her late husband had been a federal judge, and she still moved in circles where favors were traded like currency. She served on the boards of 3 charities and 2 political action committees. She owned property in 4 states and held investments that most people could only dream about. But every person with power had pressure points. Patricia's was her reputation. She'd built her entire post-widowhood identity around being the grieving judge's wife who dedicated her life to helping disadvantaged children. The irony of a woman who psychologically tortured her own grandson while publicly championing child welfare was rich enough to choke on. Derek spent the afternoon conducting reconnaissance on Patricia's house. Security cameras covered the obvious approaches, but Derek had learned long ago that people who relied on technology often ignored human factors. The landscaping crew came every Tuesday. The housekeeper arrived at 9 a.m. on Wednesdays and Fridays. Patricia attended yoga classes Monday, Wednesday, and Friday mornings. More importantly, Derek discovered that Patricia's house had a basement workshop where she pursued her hobby of woodworking, a detail that hadn't appeared in any public records. The workshop had soundproofing installed for noise reduction and a separate entrance through the backyard. Perfect. As evening approached, Derek returned to his house. Lindsay's Honda was back in the driveway, but Brad's car was nowhere to be seen. Derek watched from across the street as Lindsay moved through the house, her body language betraying nervous energy. She kept checking her phone, looking out windows, jumping at small sounds. Guilt was a wonderful thing. It made people predictable. Derek's phone rang. Unknown number. Morrison. Daddy. Tyler's voice was small, scared, but alive. Derek's emotional control cracked for just a moment. Tyler, are you okay, son? I want to come home. Aunt Dorothy is mean, and this place smells bad, and there's no TV, and... The line went dead. Derek stared at his phone for 10 seconds, processing the implications. They'd let Tyler call him, which meant they wanted Derek to know where his son was. It was a message. We have something you love, and we'll hurt it if you don't behave. Another miscalculation. Derek Morrison had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to eliminate an enemy was to let them think they were winning until the moment you destroyed them completely. In psychological warfare, perceived weakness was often the most devastating weapon. Derek started the Jeep and drove back to Patricia's house. It was time to begin the education of people who thought they understood what a soldier could do when everything he loved was threatened. They were about to learn the difference between a warrior and a weapon. Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. Derek's phone rang at 11:47 p.m. He'd been expecting the call. Derek. Lindsay's voice was shaky, artificial. You're home. I am. We need to talk. I'm listening. Not over the phone. Can you meet me at Riverside Park tomorrow? The playground where we used to take Tyler. Derek smiled coldly. Even now, she was trying to manipulate him emotionally, choosing a location tied to family memories. What time? 2 o'clock. I'll be there. After Lindsay hung up, Derek continued his preparations. He'd spent the evening reviewing every piece of intelligence his contacts had gathered. Patricia Kellerman's financial records revealed interesting patterns. Large cash withdrawals coinciding with Derek's deployments, payments to a private investigator, and wire transfers to an offshore account that Brad Henley had opened 6 months ago. They'd been planning this for longer than Derek had initially calculated. The affair was just the surface layer of something more sophisticated, a systematic effort to isolate Derek, alienate him from his son, and position themselves to claim insurance benefits and military survivor benefits if Derek died in combat. When that didn't happen quickly enough, they'd move to psychological warfare, break Derek emotionally, force him to make mistakes, create grounds for divorce proceedings that would paint him as an unstable veteran. Patricia's connections in the legal system would ensure Lindsay got everything: the house, custody of Tyler, and Derek's military pension. But they'd made one critical error. They'd assumed Derek would react emotionally, immediately, like a grieving father and betrayed husband. They'd expected him to confront Lindsay directly, maybe get violent, definitely get sloppy. Instead, Derek Morrison was approaching this like he'd approached every other mission, with patience, precision, and the absolute certainty that his enemies would destroy themselves if given enough rope. The next morning, Derek visited Tyler's school. Principal Rebecca Hayes was a kind woman in her 50s who remembered Derek from various school events before his last deployment. "Mr. Morrison." She seemed genuinely pleased to see him. "Welcome home. Tyler must be so excited." Derek's expression remained neutral. "Actually, Mrs. Hayes, that's why I'm here. Tyler isn't at home." The principal's smile faded. "I'm sorry. Tyler hasn't been in school for over a week, according to my neighbor. His mother told me he was with relatives, but I'm concerned. Has the school received any official notification about Tyler's absence?" Mrs. Hayes checked her computer, her frown deepening. "No, we haven't. In fact, Mrs. Morrison missed Tyler's enrollment meeting 3 weeks ago. We've been trying to reach her." She looked up at Derek with growing concern. "Mr. Morrison, I'm required to report extended unexplained absences to social services." "Understand. What's the process for that?" "Well, typically we try to resolve it with the family first, but if a child has been absent for more than 10 consecutive school days without explanation..." She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. Derek nodded sympathetically. "Mrs. Hayes, I need to ask you to document everything carefully. There may be complications with my wife's family. I want to make sure Tyler's best interests are protected." Mrs. Hayes was nobody's fool. She'd seen enough military families to recognize the signs of trouble. "Of course. And Mr. Morrison, if you need resources for family counseling or support services..." "Thank you. I'll keep that in mind." Derek left the school knowing that he'd just lit a fuse that would reach social services within 48 hours. In Colorado, unexplained child absence triggered mandatory investigations, especially when one parent raised concerns about the other. Patricia's political connections might slow the process, but they couldn't stop it entirely. At 1:45 p.m., Derek arrived at Riverside Park. He'd chosen his position carefully, a bench with clear sight lines in multiple directions, back against a tree, escape routes mapped. Old habits. Lindsay arrived 10 minutes late, accompanied by Brad Henley. Interesting. She'd brought backup, which suggested she expected this conversation to go badly. Lindsay looked terrible. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back carelessly. Her makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes, and she moved with the jittery energy of someone operating on too much caffeine and too little sleep. Brad, by contrast, tried to project confidence. He wore an expensive suit that didn't quite fit his frame and carried himself like a man who'd watched too many movies about tough guys. Derek categorized him immediately. Civilian, soft, dangerous only because desperate people did unpredictable things. "Derek," Lindsay sat down beside him, leaving Brad standing awkwardly nearby. "Thank you for coming. Where's Tyler?" "He's safe. He's with my aunt in Wyoming, just for a little while, until..." She took a shaky breath. "Until we figure things out." Derek turned to look at her directly. Even after everything, Lindsay was still beautiful. That had been part of the problem. Derek had fallen in love with her face and never bothered to look deeper until it was too late. "Figure what out?" "Our marriage. Us. This whole situation." "What situation is that?" Lindsay's composure cracked slightly. "Derek, don't make this harder than it has to be. You know, things have been difficult between us for years. Your deployments, the time apart, the way the military always came first. Before or after you started sleeping with him?" Derek nodded toward Brad, without looking away from Lindsay. Brad stepped forward, puffing up like an angry rooster. "Hey, watch your tone. Lindsay doesn't deserve..." Derek's gaze shifted to Brad, and whatever the insurance adjuster saw in those eyes made him step back involuntarily. "You're right," Derek said mildly. "She doesn't deserve to be spoken to respectfully." That privilege ended when she threw my son into a storm and told him he ruined her life. Lindsay's face went white. That's not. I didn't. Mrs. Chen saw everything. She heard everything, including your mother's contribution to Tyler's education about his value. Derek watched Lindsay process the implications. Her family had thought they were being careful, but they'd underestimated the surveillance capabilities of nosy neighbors and caring teachers and trained soldiers who knew how to gather intelligence. Derek, you don't understand. Tyler was being difficult, and Mom was just trying to help discipline him, and things got out of hand. Lindsay's voice rose with desperation. Your brat ruined my life. Those were your exact words to an 8-year-old child. Derek's voice remained calm, conversational. Tell me, Lindsay, when did Tyler ruin your life? When he was born? When he learned to walk? When he started calling me daddy instead of you? Brad apparently decided this was his moment to take control. Listen, Morrison, I know this is tough, but Lindsay's made her choice. She's filing for divorce, and she's going to get custody of the kid. Your military record shows multiple deployments, dangerous assignments, psychological stress indicators. Any judge is going to see that Tyler needs stability. Derek stood up slowly. Brad was maybe 3 inches taller, but Derek's presence made the height difference irrelevant. My military record shows 22 years of decorated service protecting people like you. What does your record show, Brad? Brad's bravado faltered. What? Your record? Your history? The reason you're $60,000 in debt to bookies who break legs for late payments. The reason your ex-wife took out a restraining order. The reason you've been fired from 3 insurance companies for falsifying claims investigations. The color drained from Brad's face. How did you? I'm very good at finding things out. Derek's smile was arctic. Would you like me to tell Lindsay about the time you spent in county lockup for stalking your ex-wife? Or should we discuss your current plan to stage my death and claim my life insurance? Lindsay shot to her feet. That's insane. Brad would never. Wouldn't he? Derek pulled out his phone and played a recorded conversation from the bug he'd planted in Lindsay's car. Patricia's voice filled the air. Insurance policies will pay out triple for accidental death during active duty. Brad knows how to make these things look convincing. The playground seemed to shrink around them. Other parents began noticing the tension, gathering their children closer. Lindsay stared at Brad with dawning horror. You told me this was about love, about building a life together. Brad's mask finally slipped completely. Love doesn't pay off gambling debts, sweetheart, but $250,000 in insurance money and a military pension sure as hell does. Derek watched Lindsay's world collapse in real time. The affair had been bad enough, but realizing she'd been manipulated into a murder conspiracy broke something fundamental in her expression. Tyler, she whispered. Where's Tyler really? Derek answered before Brad could lie again. Dorothy Kellerman's ranch in Wyoming, a place where children disappear for months without anyone asking questions. A place where your mother sent him after you threw him into a storm for interfering with your boyfriend's plan to kill me. Lindsay sat down heavily on the bench, her hands shaking. I didn't know. You knew enough. Derek's voice carried the finality of a judge's gavel. You knew Tyler was inconvenient. You knew I was an obstacle. You knew your mother hated my influence on our son. What you didn't know was that you were all expendable once Brad got what he wanted. Derek turned to Brad, who was backing away slowly. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to drive back to Patricia's house. You're going to collect Tyler, personally, and bring him home. You have 24 hours. And if I don't, Brad tried to sound defiant, but his voice cracked. Derek's smile was the kind that made enemy combatants surrender without firing a shot. Then I stopped being civilized. Derek walked away, leaving Lindsay sobbing on the bench and Brad calculating how fast he could disappear. Behind him, he heard Lindsay call out, Derek, please. I can fix this. I can make it right. Derek didn't turn around. In 24 hours, he'd know whether they were smart enough to give him what he wanted. If they weren't, he'd take it anyway. And then the real education would begin. Chapter 4, The Hunter's Game. Derek didn't wait 24 hours. That would have been civilized, and Derek Morrison had officially stopped being civilized the moment his son called him from a place that smelled bad and had no television. At 3:17 a.m., Derek stood in Patricia Kellerman's backyard, studying the house like a problem to be solved. Security cameras covered the front yard and driveway, but the backyard was a surveillance blind spot, typical civilian thinking that focused on obvious approaches while ignoring tactical realities. The basement workshop entrance was exactly where Derek had observed it during his earlier reconnaissance. A separate door, soundproofed walls, and no direct connection to the main house's security system. Patricia's late husband had designed it as a retreat where he could pursue his hobbies without disturbing his wife. Now it would serve a different purpose. Derek picked the lock in 47 seconds, a skill that had served him well in places where knocking wasn't an option. Inside, he found exactly what he'd expected: expensive woodworking equipment, half-finished furniture projects, and the kind of organized precision that spoke to obsessive personality traits. He also found something unexpected: a wall safe hidden behind a pegboard of tools. Derek smiled as he examined the lock mechanism. Military-grade safes required explosives or professional cracking equipment. Civilian safes could usually be opened by someone who understood the psychology of the people who bought them. Patricia would have chosen a combination that meant something to her, but wasn't obvious to thieves. Derek tried her late husband's birth date, their anniversary, her own birthday. Nothing. Then he tried Tyler's birthday, and the safe clicked open. Inside were documents that painted a picture of systematic financial manipulation spanning years. Insurance policies on Derek that Patricia had taken out without his knowledge, listing herself as beneficiary in case of Lindsay's death during military action. Legal documents prepared in advance for custody proceedings, including psychiatric evaluations of Derek commissioned from doctors who specialized in declaring military veterans unfit for parental responsibility. Most damning were the correspondence files between Patricia and a private investigator who'd been tracking Derek's movements, documenting his associates, and building a profile designed to support claims of dangerous instability. The investigator had been paid to find evidence of PTSD, violent tendencies, or substance abuse that could be used against Derek in court. But the most interesting discovery was a folder labeled Tyler, Long-Term Solutions. Inside were brochures from military boarding schools in foreign countries, therapeutic programs for oppositional children, and correspondence with lawyers about severing parental rights based on genetic predisposition to violence inherited from father. Derek photographed everything with a camera that automatically uploaded images to encrypted servers in 3 different countries. Evidence was useful, but Derek had learned long ago that the threat of exposure was often more powerful than exposure itself. He left the house exactly as he'd found it, with one small addition: a surveillance device that would monitor all electronic communications going in and out of Patricia's home network. Knowledge was ammunition, and Derek intended to be heavily armed. By 7 a.m., Derek was parked outside Brad Henley's apartment complex. Brad lived in a converted warehouse in the kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business and asked no questions. Perfect for a man who owed money to dangerous people and needed to stay invisible. Derek waited. Patience was a sniper's greatest virtue, and Derek had spent months at a time waiting for the perfect shot. Compared to lying motionless in a desert for 6 hours while enemy patrols passed within 10 feet, sitting in an air-conditioned Jeep drinking coffee was practically luxury. At 9:23 a.m., Brad emerged from the building, looking exactly like a man who hadn't slept. He'd apparently spent the night deciding whether to run or fight, and Derek could see from his body language that he'd chosen neither. Brad was preparing to negotiate, which meant he still thought he had something Derek wanted. Wrong again. Derek followed Brad to a truck stop diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where conversations couldn't be overheard and meetings could be denied. Brad had chosen the location, which told Derek something about his mindset. He was thinking like a civilian: find neutral ground, establish dialogue, work out a compromise. Derek parked across the street and watched Brad pace nervously inside the diner, checking his phone every 30 seconds. At exactly 10 a.m., Derek crossed the street and entered the diner. Brad waved him over to a corner booth, trying to project confidence that his sweating forehead contradicted. Morrison, thanks for coming. Derek slid into the booth without removing his jacket. Where's Tyler? That's what I want to talk about. Look, I think there's been some misunderstandings. Where's Tyler? Brad's attempt at control evaporated. He's safe, okay? Patricia's handling it. But there are some complications. Derek waited. The thing is, Brad continued, Dorothy's place isn't exactly official. There are some legal issues if we just show up and demand the kid back. We need to be careful about how we handle this. Derek's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness made Brad shift uncomfortably. What I'm saying is, maybe we can work something out that benefits everyone. You want Tyler back, Lindsay wants stability, Patricia wants what's best for the family. Brad leaned forward conspiratorially. And I have some debts that need handling before certain people start getting impatient. You want money. I want a solution that works for everyone. You've got military benefits, pension payments, that life insurance Patricia mentioned. There's enough to go around if we're smart about it. Derek studied Brad like a scientist examining an interesting specimen of bacteria. You're proposing I pay you to return my kidnapped son. It's not kidnapping. It's temporary custody while the adults work out. Derek's hand moved faster than Brad's eyes could follow. One moment, they were having a conversation. The next, Derek's fingers were locked around Brad's wrist with enough pressure to stop circulation. Brad's yelp of pain drew glances from other diners. Here's what's going to happen, Derek said in a voice barely above a whisper. You're going to give me Dorothy Kellerman's exact address, her phone number, and detailed directions to wherever Tyler is being held. Then you're going to call her and tell her that Tyler's father is coming to collect him, and anyone who interferes will be dealt with appropriately. Brad tried to pull away, but Derek's grip tightened until the bones in his wrist began to separate. You're crazy. You can't just. I can do anything I want, Brad. I've been doing anything I want for 22 years in places where there are no laws, no witnesses, and no consequences. The only difference is that now it's personal. Derek increased the pressure until Brad's vision blurred with pain. The phone number. Brad gasped out the information between whimpers. Derek released his wrist and watched Brad massage the circulation back into his hand. Now the call. Brad's fingers shook as he dialed. Dorothy? It's Brad. Yeah, I know it's early. Listen, there's been a change of plans with the Morrison kid. He glanced nervously at Derek. His father is coming to pick him up. Today. And Dorothy? Don't make this difficult. Trust me on this. Brad ended the call and slumped back in the booth. There. Happy. Derek stood up. Not even close. What's that supposed to mean? Derek looked down at Brad with the expression of a man who'd made a final decision. It means you're going to disappear, Brad. You're going to pack whatever you can carry, get in your car, and drive until you're at least 1,000 miles away from here. You're going to start a new life under a new name in a place where nobody knows you owe money to people who break legs. I can't just. Yes, you can. Because the alternative is that I hunt you down and show you exactly what 22 years of specialized training looks like when applied to someone who threatened my family. Derek leaned closer. I know where you live, where you work, where you eat, where you shop, and where you go when you think nobody's watching. I know the names and addresses of everyone you owe money to, everyone you've ever worked with, and everyone who might hide you. If you're still in Colorado in 48 hours, I'll assume you've decided you'd rather deal with me than with your creditors. Derek straightened up. Choose wisely. Derek walked out of the diner without looking back. Through the window, he watched Brad sit frozen in the booth, processing the mathematics of his situation. Owing money to bookies was dangerous, but bookies were businessmen who ultimately wanted their money back. Derek Morrison was something else entirely. Derek drove toward Wyoming with the radio off, and his mind focused on the mission ahead. Tyler was 150 miles away in the custody of people who had systematically abused, manipulated, and terrorized him. That situation was about to end. But first, Derek had one more call to make. Garrett's security. This is Morrison. I need a complete background workup on Dorothy Kellerman, including property records, employee information, and any law enforcement contacts. Priority rush. Timeline. 3 hours. Derek hung up and pressed harder on the accelerator. The education of the Kellerman family was about to enter its next phase. and Derek Morrison had always been an excellent teacher. Chapter 5. The Reckoning Unfolds. The Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional cluster of buildings that optimistically called itself a town. Derek had been driving for 3 hours when his phone rang with an update from Garrett Security. "Morrison, got your intel on Dorothy Kellerman. You're not going to like it." Derek listened as his contact ran through the details. Dorothy's Therapeutic Ranch was a legitimate business on paper, licensed as a residential treatment facility for troubled youth. But the licensing was minimal, the oversight practically non-existent, and the location deliberately isolated. More troubling were the incident reports filed with local law enforcement over the past 5 years. 3 separate investigations for child abuse allegations, all closed due to insufficient evidence and uncooperative witnesses. 2 former employees had filed complaints about Dorothy's methods, then suddenly withdrawn their statements and left the state. The local sheriff is a guy named Robert Kellerman, Dorothy's nephew. Make of that what you will. Derek made plenty of it. Dorothy had bought herself a fiefdom in the middle of nowhere, protected by family connections and the kind of legal isolation that money could purchase. Children sent to her ranch were effectively disappeared until their families decided to retrieve them, if they ever did. How many kids are currently at the facility? Unknown. They're not required to report exact numbers. Just maintain general licensing for up to 20 residents. Could be 5 kids, could be 20. Derek thanked his contact and continued driving. The mathematics of the situation were becoming clearer. Tyler wasn't just being hidden. He was being held in a place designed to break children who inconvenienced their families. Every mile Derek drove increased his certainty that whatever he found at Dorothy's ranch would require a response that couldn't be contained within civilized boundaries. The GPS led him onto increasingly smaller roads, from highway to county road to gravel track to something that barely qualified as navigable. The ranch sat in a valley surrounded by low hills, invisible from any main road and accessible only through a single narrow driveway that could be easily monitored. Derek parked a mile away and approached on foot, moving with the silent precision that had kept him alive in hostile territory. Through binoculars, he studied the compound. A main house, 3 smaller buildings that looked like dormitories, and a large barn. High fences surrounded the entire property, topped with barbed wire that was supposedly for keeping wildlife out, but could just as easily keep children in. 2 people were visible in the main yard. A woman who matched Dorothy's description and a large man who moved like security rather than staff. Derek counted windows, noted the locations of external lights, and mapped potential entry and exit routes. Then he saw Tyler. His son was smaller than Derek remembered, thinner, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned that sudden movements brought unwanted attention. Tyler was scrubbing something near the barn under the supervision of an older teenager, and even from a distance, Derek could see the defeated slump of his shoulders. Derek's emotional control cracked for exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of rage that he'd been carefully managing since discovering his son's situation. The feeling was volcanic, purifying, and absolutely lethal. Then Derek Morrison, Special Forces veteran and expert in unconventional warfare, took control again. At 6:47 p.m., Derek walked up the ranch's front driveway like a man who had every right to be there. The security guard emerged from the main house, 6'4", probably 250 pounds, with the kind of build that came from powerlifting rather than practical strength. "Help you." The guard's tone suggested that help was the last thing Derek was likely to receive. "I'm here for Tyler Morrison. Don't know nobody by that name." Derek smiled pleasantly. "Would you check with Dorothy? Tell her Derek Morrison is here to collect his son." The guard studied Derek with the assessment of someone who'd learned to categorize threats. Derek knew what he was seeing. Average height, lean build, civilian clothes, no obvious weapons. The guard was making the same mistake everyone else had made. "Wait here." The guard went inside, leaving Derek alone in the yard. Through the windows, Derek could see a heated conversation taking place. Dorothy was animated, pointing toward the door, clearly arguing for a response that wouldn't involve returning Tyler voluntarily. The guard returned with backup. 2 more men, all carrying the kind of confidence that came from intimidating families who couldn't fight back. Mrs. Kellerman says the boy is in protective custody and ain't going nowhere without proper legal documentation. Derek nodded reasonably. Understand. May I speak with Tyler? Just to verify he's okay. No visitors without authorization. From whom? Mrs. Kellerman. And Mrs. Kellerman's authorization comes from? The first guard was getting irritated. Listen, buddy, you need to turn around and drive back where you came from. This is private property, and you're trespassing. Derek continued smiling. Actually, according to Wyoming state law, licensed child care facilities are required to allow parental visitation unless there's a court order preventing it. Is there a court order preventing me from seeing my son? The guards exchanged glances. Clearly, most parents who came here weren't familiar with state regulations. I'll need to see some identification, the first guard said. Derek handed over his military ID, knowing they'd have to call in to verify his identity. While they were occupied with that process, Derek used the time to complete his tactical assessment. 3 guards, probably armed, but not displaying weapons openly. Multiple buildings, unknown number of children inside. Only one clear exit route. The kind of situation that required finesse rather than force. At least initially. 20 minutes later, Dorothy Kellerman emerged from the house. She was exactly what Derek had expected. 60-something, steel gray hair, and the kind of rigid bearing that came from absolute authority over powerless people. Mr. Morrison. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm surprised to see you here. I've come for Tyler. Tyler is receiving treatment for behavioral issues. Removing him prematurely would be counterproductive to his therapeutic progress. Derek's smile never wavered. What specific behavioral issues? Defiance, aggression toward authority figures, inappropriate attachment to military culture. Typical symptoms of children raised in unstable military households. I see. And who diagnosed these conditions? Dorothy's confidence flickered slightly. Our staff psychologist conducted a comprehensive evaluation. Your staff psychologist. Who would that be? Dr. Martin Reeves. Derek pulled out his phone and made a quick search. Dr. Martin Reeves, licensed in Wyoming for 6 months, previously licensed in Nevada until his certification was suspended for falsifying patient records. Dorothy's composure cracked visibly. Mr. Morrison, I don't appreciate your tone. This facility operates under proper legal authority. From your nephew, Sheriff Kellerman, who has no jurisdiction over child custody matters involving out-of-state residents. Derek had done his homework during the drive. Dorothy's operation depended on legal intimidation and geographical isolation, but both tactics failed when confronted by someone who understood the actual law. Mr. Morrison, Dorothy said, her voice taking on a threatening edge, perhaps you should consider whether pursuing this matter is in your best interests. Or Tyler's. Children who are suddenly removed from structured environments sometimes experience setbacks. Derek's smile disappeared completely. Are you threatening my son? I'm explaining the realities of child psychology. Derek stepped closer to Dorothy, and something in his movement made all 3 guards tense. Mrs. Kellerman, I'm going to explain some realities to you. I've spent 22 years in places where people like you wouldn't last 22 minutes. I've dealt with warlords, terrorists, and dictators who thought they were untouchable because they controlled isolated territories and corrupt local officials. Derek's voice remained conversational, but the words carried the weight of absolute certainty. You're going to bring Tyler out here, right now, and you can do it with a smile. Because if you don't, I'm going to make some phone calls to people who specialize in problems that can't be solved through legal channels. Dorothy tried to maintain her authority. You can't threaten me. I have protection. From your nephew? The sheriff who's taking bribes to ignore child abuse reports. Derek pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph of Sheriff Kellerman accepting an envelope from a man Derek's contacts had identified as a representative of Dorothy's operation. Or maybe you mean the state bureaucrats who've been paid to overlook your licensing violations? Derek had spent the drive making those calls to people who specialized in problems. The corrupt sheriff the bribed officials, the falsified records, all of it was already being documented by investigators who didn't answer to local authority. Your protection is evaporating as we speak, Mrs. Kellerman. In about 6 hours, this place is going to be crawling with federal investigators, state child services officials, and media representatives who've been given very detailed information about your operation. Derek put his phone away. You have exactly one way to avoid spending the rest of your life in federal prison for child trafficking. Bring Tyler out here, now, and pretend this conversation never happened. Dorothy stared at Derek for 30 seconds, processing the implications. She'd built her operation on the assumption that parents would be emotionally compromised, legally ignorant, and practically helpless. Derek Morrison was none of those things. Roberts, she said to the first guard, bring the Morrison boy. 5 minutes later, Tyler emerged from one of the dormitory buildings, escorted by Roberts. Derek's son looked exactly like what he was, a traumatized child who'd been systematically broken down by adults who were supposed to protect him. But when Tyler saw Derek, something lit up in his eyes that all of Dorothy's therapeutic methods hadn't been able to extinguish. Daddy! Tyler ran toward Derek, and Derek caught him in an embrace that conveyed 22 years of training in how to protect what mattered most. I'm sorry, Daddy. Tyler whispered against Derek's shoulder. I tried to be good, but they said you didn't want me anymore, and Mom said I was bad, and none of that is true, son. None of it is your fault, and nobody is ever going to hurt you again. Derek looked over Tyler's head at Dorothy. If I ever hear that you've contacted anyone in my family or attempted to interfere with my son's life in any way, I will come back here. And next time, I won't be interested in legal solutions. Derek carried Tyler to his Jeep, buckled him into the passenger seat, and drove away from Dorothy Kellerman's ranch without looking back. But he wasn't finished with the Kellerman family. Not even close. Chapter 6, The Price of Betrayal. The drive back to Colorado gave Derek time to listen to Tyler's story. His son spoke in the halting, careful way of children who'd learned that honesty could be dangerous, but gradually the truth emerged. Lindsay had thrown him outside during the storm after he'd overheard her talking to Brad about when Derek is gone. Tyler had tried to tell his mother that he'd heard something scary, and Lindsay had exploded, screaming that Tyler was ruining everything, that he was just like his father, that she wished he'd never been born. Patricia had arrived during the storm and found Tyler shivering on the porch. Instead of bringing him inside, she'd told Lindsay that the boy needed to learn his place, that military children had to be broken of their entitled attitudes before they became dangerous like their fathers. They'd driven Tyler to Wyoming that same night, telling him that Derek had been killed in combat, and that Tyler would be staying with Aunt Dorothy until new arrangements could be made. Dorothy had confirmed the story, adding that Tyler's behavioral problems made him unsuitable for normal foster care. Derek listened to his son's story with the kind of cold rage that had once made enemy commanders surrender rather than face him in battle. Tyler had spent 3 weeks believing his father was dead, believing he was unwanted, believing he was fundamentally broken. But what destroyed Derek's last connection to civilized behavior was Tyler's final revelation. Aunt Dorothy said if I ever try to run away or tell anyone what happened, she'd make sure I never saw you again. She said military kids who caused trouble just disappeared, and nobody would look for them because soldiers don't care about family. Derek pulled into a rest stop and held his son while Tyler cried, not just for the fear and loneliness, but for the relief of discovering that everything he'd been told was a lie. Tyler, Derek said when the tears stopped, I need you to understand something. Everything they told you is wrong. You are not broken. You are not unwanted. You are not responsible for anything the adults did. And nobody is ever going to take you away from me again. Derek's phone had been buzzing with messages throughout the drive. Most were from Lindsay and Patricia, alternating between threats and attempts at negotiation. But one message was from his contact at Garrett Security, package delivered. Check your email. Derek reviewed the intelligence while Tyler slept in the passenger seat. His contacts had been busy during the 12 hours Derek had been in Wyoming. Patricia's house was now under complete surveillance. Brad Henley had been tracked to a motel near the Nevada border, where he was apparently attempting to disappear as Derek had suggested. Lindsay had filed a missing persons report on Tyler, claiming Derek had kidnapped him. But most interesting was the financial intelligence. Patricia's accounts showed significant cash withdrawals over the past month, and communication intercepts revealed she'd been arranging to liquidate assets quickly. She was preparing to run. Derek called his contact. Status on the federal investigation? Moving fast. The Wyoming authorities are already scrambling to distance themselves from Dorothy's operation. Sheriff Kellerman has suddenly decided to take early retirement. Dorothy herself has been placed under protective custody after she started cooperating with investigators. And Patricia? Flight to Switzerland scheduled for tomorrow morning. Looks like she's planning to relocate permanently. Derek smiled coldly. Cancel that flight. Legally or illegally? Your choice. Derek ended the call and made another decision. The Kellerman family had spent years building their little empire of cruelty and manipulation. They'd operated with impunity because their victims were children and their methods were psychologically sophisticated rather than obviously criminal. But Derek Morrison had learned something important during his 22 years of military service. Sometimes the only way to stop a predator was to become something more dangerous than they were. At 11:30 p.m., Derek tucked Tyler into his own bed in his own room in his own house. His son fell asleep, clutching the stuffed elephant that Derek had retrieved from the basement, where Patricia had hidden it. At 11:45 p.m., Derek armed himself with items that weren't legally available to civilians and drove toward Patricia Kellerman's house. The Kellerman mansion was dark except for lights in the upstairs master bedroom, where Patricia was apparently packing for a flight to freedom. Derek's surveillance equipment indicated she was alone. Lindsay was staying at a hotel, Brad was 500 miles away, and Patricia had dismissed her household staff for the evening. Derek disabled the security system using methods he'd learned in places where security systems were matters of life and death. He entered through the basement workshop, moving through Patricia's house like smoke, until he stood in the doorway of her bedroom. Patricia looked up from her suitcase and froze. Even in her 60s, she was still an attractive woman, but fear aged her 20 years in 20 seconds. Hello, Patricia. She tried to maintain composure. You're trespassing. I'm calling the police. No, you're not. Derek showed her the device in his hand that was jamming all electronic signals in the house. You're going to sit down and listen. Patricia sat down heavily on her bed, surrounded by expensive clothes and jewelry she'd never wear again. You have a choice, Derek said, settling into a chair across from her. You can disappear tonight and never return, never contact anyone in my family again, never attempt to interfere with Tyler's life in any way. If you choose this option, you get to live. Patricia's voice shook. What's the other option? Derek's smile was everything she'd feared it would be. You fight me. You try to use your money, your connections, your lawyers to continue the war you started against my family. If you choose this option, I'll show you what happens to people who threaten my son. You can't intimidate me. I have resources. Derek pulled out a tablet and showed Patricia a live video feed from her sister Dorothy's ranch. Federal agents were loading files into trucks while Dorothy herself sat in handcuffs, crying as investigators documented years of systematic child abuse. Your resources are gone, Patricia. Your sister is cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. Your nephew, the sheriff, has resigned and is providing testimony about the bribes you paid him. The private investigator you hired to spy on me is sharing his files with the FBI. Derek swiped to the next screen, showing bank records and financial transactions. Your offshore accounts have been frozen by federal warrant. Your property assets are being seized under child trafficking statutes. Your charitable board positions have been terminated. Patricia stared at the screen in growing horror. That's impossible. I have legal protection. You had protection from local corruption and political connections. But you made one critical mistake. You committed federal crimes across state lines involving the welfare of children. That brings in people who don't care about your late husband's judicial connections. Derek put the tablet away. But here's the interesting part, Patricia. All of this evidence came from one source, Dorothy. She's been keeping detailed records of every child sent to her facility, every payment you made, every conversation you had about manipulating custody arrangements. She documented everything because she was planning to blackmail you eventually. Patricia's face crumpled as she realized the implications. Her own sister had been preparing to destroy her, and Derek had simply accelerated the timeline. What do you want? Patricia whispered. I want you gone. Tonight. Forever. I want you to withdraw any legal claims related to Tyler, sign documents transferring all remaining assets to a trust fund for his education, and disappear so completely that even I can't find you. Derek leaned forward. Because if you don't, if you make me hunt you down, if you force me to spend my retirement years making sure you never hurt another child, then I'll stop being civilized entirely. And Patricia? You really don't want to find out what that looks like. Derek left a stack of legal documents on Patricia's nightstand. Your flight to Switzerland has been canceled. There's a bus ticket to Mexico City in the kitchen. You have 2 hours to decide whether you're smart enough to take it. Derek walked out of Patricia Kellerman's house the same way he'd entered, like a ghost that had never been there. But he left behind something that would haunt Patricia for the rest of her life. The absolute certainty that Derek Morrison would be watching, waiting, and ready to finish what she'd started if she ever made the mistake of forgetting that some people were too dangerous to cross. Chapter 7. The Final Lesson. Derek woke at 5:30 a.m. to find Tyler sitting at the kitchen table, fully dressed and eating cereal with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned that routine was safety. Good morning, son. Tyler looked up with eyes that were still too careful, too adult for an 8-year-old. Are we leaving again? Derek sat down across from his son and studied his face. No, Tyler, we're staying home. But there are some things we need to finish first. Derek had spent the early morning hours reviewing intelligence reports. Patricia's bus to Mexico City had departed on schedule with one passenger matching her description. Dorothy's ranch was now a federal crime scene. Sheriff Kellerman had been arrested for corruption charges. Brad Henley had checked out of his Nevada motel and disappeared completely, probably smart enough to keep running. But Lindsay was still in Colorado, and that situation required a different kind of resolution. Derek's phone rang. Lindsay's number. Derek? Please, we need to talk. I know you have Tyler, and I know you're angry, but come to the house. Noon. Come alone. Derek hung up without waiting for her response. Tyler looked up from his cereal. Is Mom coming home? Derek chose his words carefully. Your mother is coming to talk. But Tyler, I need you to understand something important. Sometimes adults make choices that hurt the people they're supposed to protect. When that happens, there are consequences. Tyler nodded with the solemnity of a child who'd learned that adults couldn't always be trusted. Is Mom in trouble? Yes, son. She is. Derek spent the morning making preparations. He set up a recording device in the living room, legal in Colorado with single-party consent. He arranged for a social worker to be on standby, armed with documentation of Tyler's treatment at Dorothy's ranch. And he made one final call to his contact at Garrett Security. I need a psychological evaluation team standing by. Court certified, immediate availability. What kind of evaluation? Fitness for parental custody. At exactly noon, Lindsay's Honda pulled into the driveway. Derek watched from the window as his wife sat in her car for 5 minutes, gathering courage for a conversation she knew would end her marriage and possibly her freedom. Lindsay looked terrible. Her usual careful appearance had been replaced by the disheveled look of someone who'd been crying for days. She moved with the shaky uncertainty of someone whose world had collapsed and who was desperately trying to hold onto anything familiar. Derek opened the door before she knocked. Lindsay, Derek, thank you for letting me come. Derek led her into the living room where Tyler was waiting on the couch, holding his stuffed elephant and watching his mother with the wary attention of a small animal evaluating a potential predator. Lindsay's composure broke when she saw her son. Tyler, baby, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I love you so much. She moved toward Tyler, but Derek's hand on her arm stopped her. Sit down, Lindsay. The authority in Derek's voice was absolute. Lindsay sat in the chair across from Tyler, tears streaming down her face. Tyler, Derek said gently, your mother wants to talk to you. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to. If you want to leave the room at any time, just tell me. Tyler nodded, clutching his elephant closer. Lindsay wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself. Tyler, sweetie, I made some terrible mistakes. I said things I didn't mean, and I hurt you, and I'm so sorry. Tyler's voice was small but clear. You said I ruined your life. Lindsay's face crumpled. I didn't mean it. I was upset and scared, and you threw me outside in the storm. I know, baby, and that was wrong, so wrong. Mommy was just. You told Aunt Dorothy that Daddy was dead. Lindsay's attempts at explanation died in her throat. She looked at Tyler's face, serious, hurt, but not hostile, and seemed to realize that her son was giving her a chance to tell the truth. Yes, Lindsay whispered. I did all those things, and I can't take any of them back. Derek watched his wife struggle with concepts she'd never had to face before. Genuine accountability, consequences that couldn't be negotiated away, the reality that some damage couldn't be undone with apologies. Tyler, Derek said, do you have any questions for your mother? Tyler was quiet for a long moment. Then, why did you want Daddy to be dead? Lindsay's remaining composure shattered completely. I wasn't thinking. Tyler, grown-up relationships are complicated, and sometimes people make mistakes. That's not an answer, Tyler said with the devastating honesty of childhood. You wanted Daddy to be dead so you could be with Brad. That's why you put me with Aunt Dorothy. Because I was in the way. Derek felt a surge of pride mixed with heartbreak. His son had inherited his ability to see clearly through deception and manipulation. Tyler would never be an easy victim again. Lindsay looked between Tyler and Derek with growing desperation. Derek, please. I know I made mistakes, but I'm still Tyler's mother. I can change. I can get help. We can work this out. Derek's expression remained neutral. Tell Tyler about the insurance policies. Lindsay's face went white. I don't know what you mean. Derek pulled out a file folder and placed it on the coffee table. Life insurance policies worth $250,000, taken out on me without my knowledge, with you as primary beneficiary. Purchased 6 months ago through Brad's insurance company. Lindsay stared at the documents as if they might disappear through force of will. Tell Tyler about the custody arrangements you made before I came home. Derek placed another set of documents on the table. Legal filings prepared in advance, declaring me psychologically unfit for parental responsibility due to combat trauma. Psychiatric evaluations commissioned from doctors who never examined me. Tyler watched his mother with the kind of focused attention Derek had seen in combat soldiers evaluating enemy positions. Tell Tyler about the plan to have me declared dead if the insurance policies didn't pay out fast enough. Lindsay's voice was barely a whisper. Derek, please don't do this in front of Tyler. Tyler needs to understand who his mother really is, Derek said with finality. He needs to understand that the woman who threw him into a storm and told him his father was dead isn't someone who made mistakes. She's someone who made choices. Derek stood up and walked to the window, looking out the neighborhood where he'd planned to raise his son in safety and security. Tyler, your mother and her family conspired to have me killed so that they could claim my military benefits and insurance money. When that didn't work, they decided to drive me away by destroying everything I cared about, starting with you. Tyler looked at his mother with an expression Derek had never seen on his son's face before. Adult disappointment mixed with the kind of cold assessment that came from understanding betrayal. Tyler, Lindsay pleaded, please don't look at me like that. I'm still your mother. I still love you. Tyler's response was delivered with a matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. No, you don't. If you loved me, you wouldn't have hurt me to hurt Daddy. Derek turned back to face Lindsay. You have a choice to make. You can fight this, hire lawyers, claim parental rights, try to convince a judge that you're a fit mother despite kidnapping your son and conspiring to murder your husband. That fight will involve criminal charges, federal investigations, and Tyler testifying about what you did to him. Derek's voice remained conversational, but the words carried the weight of absolute finality. Or you can sign documents relinquishing all parental rights, agree to never contact Tyler again, and disappear from our lives permanently. Lindsay looked around the room desperately, as if searching for an ally or an escape route. But there was only Derek's implacable certainty and Tyler's calm evaluation of her character. If I sign those papers, Lindsay whispered, I'll never see Tyler again. That's correct. But he's my son, Derek's smile was colder than Wyoming winter. He was your son when you threw him into a storm. He was your son when you told him I was dead. He was your son when you sent him to a place where children are systematically broken. Derek placed a pen and a final set of documents on the coffee table. Now Tyler is my son, and he'll be protected by someone who understands that family means more than convenience. Lindsay stared at the papers for a long moment, then looked at Tyler one more time. Her son watched her with polite attention, as if she were a stranger he was being forced to meet. "Tyler," she said, her voice breaking, "I really do love you." Tyler considered this statement with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence. "Maybe you do, but you love yourself more." Lindsay signed the papers with shaking hands, tears dripping onto the legal documents that severed her connection to her son forever. She left without looking back, because even she understood that some betrayals couldn't survive the truth. Chapter 8. Ghosts and Consequences. 3 months later, Derek sat in a coffee shop in downtown Colorado Springs, reading a newspaper and enjoying the kind of peaceful morning he'd learned not to take for granted. Tyler was at school, a new school where he'd quickly established himself as the kid who wasn't afraid of bullies and who had an unusual understanding of what real toughness looked like. Derek's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk." B. Brad Henley. Derek had wondered when the man would resurface. Running away had probably seemed like the smart choice at the time, but men like Brad rarely learn from their mistakes. Derek typed back, "Riverside Park. 1 hour." Derek arrived early and selected a bench with optimal sightlines and multiple exit routes. Old habits. But when Brad finally appeared, Derek realized that paranoia was unnecessary. Brad Henley looked like a man who'd spent 3 months sleeping in cheap motels and living on convenience store food. His expensive clothes had been replaced with discount store alternatives. His confident swagger was gone, and he moved with the nervous energy of someone who'd learned to look over his shoulder constantly. "Morrison." Brad sat down heavily, leaving deliberate distance between himself and Derek. "You look terrible, Brad." "Yeah, well, disappearing isn't as easy as it sounds." Brad's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who discovered that running from problems didn't actually solve them. "Turns out people I owe money to are pretty good at tracking down deadbeats." Derek waited. In his experience, desperate people eventually revealed more than they intended if given enough silence. "I need your help," Brad continued. "Those guys I owe money to, they found me in Nevada. Then they found me in Arizona. They're not going to stop looking." "That sounds like a you problem." Brad's desperation intensified. "Come on, Morrison. You've got military connections, security contacts. You can make this go away." Derek studied Brad with the clinical interest of someone examining an interesting failure. "Why would I help the man who planned to murder me and steal my son?" "Because I have information you want." Derek's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness made Brad shift uncomfortably. "About Lindsay. About what really happened before you came home." Derek waited. Brad pulled out a cell phone and played a recorded conversation. Lindsay's voice filled the air, but this wasn't the woman Derek had married. This voice was cold, calculating, and discussing Derek's death with the enthusiasm of someone planning a vacation. "Has to look like an accident, but it has to happen soon. The insurance policies don't pay out if he retires without dying in combat." Patricia's voice responded, "Dorothy can handle the boy indefinitely if necessary. Military brats are easy to break once you separate them from their father's influence." Lindsay again, and Derek won't suspect anything. He thinks I'm the helpless military wife waiting faithfully at home. He has no idea I've been planning this for 2 years. Derek listened to 15 minutes of conversation that detailed exactly how thoroughly he'd been betrayed. Lindsay hadn't been seduced by Brad. She'd recruited him. Patricia hadn't been manipulating Lindsay. They'd been partners. Tyler's abuse hadn't been the result of anger or poor judgment. It had been calculated psychological warfare designed to destroy Derek's connection to his son. When the recording ended, Derek sat in silence for 30 seconds. "When was this recorded?" 6 months ago. Lindsay wanted me to help her stage your death during your last deployment, make it look like enemy action. When I said I needed time to plan it, she got impatient and decided to just wait for you to die naturally. Brad leaned forward eagerly. But this proves everything, right? This shows that Lindsay was the mastermind, that she manipulated me into helping her. You could use this to. Derek's laugh was genuinely amused. To what? Prove that my ex-wife is a sociopath? I already knew that. Prove that you're a victim? We both know that's not true. Derek stood up. Brad, you're missing the point. I don't care about evidence anymore. I don't care about justice or revenge or proving anything to anyone. Derek looked down at Brad with something approaching pity. Lindsay is gone. Patricia is gone. Dorothy is in federal prison. Tyler is safe and happy. The war is over, and I won. But what about me? Brad's voice cracked with desperation. Those guys are going to kill me. I can't keep running forever. Derek's expression hardened. Then stop running. What? You're a coward, Brad. You've been a coward your entire life. You manipulated a damaged woman instead of facing your gambling debts honestly. You planned to murder a man who never hurt you instead of taking responsibility for your mistakes. You ran away instead of accepting consequences. Derek's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. But running doesn't change what you are. It just means you die exhausted instead of standing up. Derek walked away, leaving Brad sitting alone on the bench with his desperation and his unpayable debts and his recording that proved nothing except that he'd always been exactly what Derek had identified him as, a weak man who blamed others for his weaknesses. Derek had learned something important during his 22 years of military service. Some people could be redeemed, and some people were just targets waiting for the right moment to be engaged. Brad Henley was a target, and Derek had already pulled the trigger by refusing to save him from consequences he'd earned. That evening, Derek picked Tyler up from school and drove home through the kind of quiet suburban streets where children played in yards and parents worried about normal things like homework and soccer practice. Dad, Tyler said as they pulled into their driveway. Mrs. Patterson asked if you wanted to come to the parent-teacher conference next week. Derek smiled. Of course. How are your grades? All A's. Except for art. I got a B+ in art. What happened in art? Tyler considered this seriously. I drew a picture of a family, but it was just you and me. Mrs. Patterson said families usually have more people in them, but I told her that wasn't true. Some families are exactly the right size. Derek felt the kind of pride that had nothing to do with military achievements or tactical victories. You're absolutely right, son. Some families are exactly the right size. That night, after Tyler was asleep, Derek sat on his back porch and looked up at stars that were visible here in ways they'd never been visible in the places where he'd spent his professional life. Tomorrow he'd attend a parent-teacher conference like a normal father. Next week, he'd help Tyler with a science project about solar systems. Next month, they'd go camping in mountains where the only dangers were weather and wildlife. Derek Morrison had spent 22 years protecting a country that didn't know his name from enemies who didn't deserve mercy. Now he was protecting one 8-year-old boy who meant more to him than every battle he'd won and every mission he'd completed. It was, Derek reflected, the most important job he'd ever had. And unlike his military career, this was a job where victory meant peace, not more war. Derek went inside, checked on his son one more time, and slept the kind of dreamless sleep that came from knowing that everything worth protecting was safe. Chapter 9. New Foundations. 1 year later, Derek stood in the kitchen of his house, packing lunches and checking homework with the practiced efficiency of a single father who'd learned that raising a child was more complex than any military operation he'd ever planned. Tyler bounced into the kitchen wearing a soccer uniform and the kind of confident grin that came from children who knew they were loved unconditionally. Dad, don't forget I have practice until 5:30. Already on my calendar. And don't forget your water bottle. Tyler grabbed his gear and headed for the door, then stopped and looked back at Derek with an expression that had become familiar over the past year. The look of a child who still sometimes needed reassurance that good things weren't temporary. You'll be there, right? At practice. Derek's smile was warm and certain. Wouldn't miss it, son. After Tyler left for school, Derek reviewed his schedule for the day. His security consulting business had grown steadily over the past year, specializing in personal protection for executives and families who needed real security rather than theatrical displays of force. Derek had discovered that his military skills translated perfectly to civilian applications, especially when clients understood they were hiring someone who'd spent decades protecting people who mattered. But the most satisfying part of Derek's new life was the simplicity of it. No classified missions, no life-or-death decisions, no sacrificing family for duty. Just the steady rhythm of school runs and soccer practices and bedtime stories read to a boy who'd learned to trust that his father would always be there. Derek's phone rang. Unknown number, but Derek recognized the pattern. Encrypted call routed through multiple servers. Morrison, Colonel Torres here. How's retirement treating you, Derek? Derek smiled. No complaints, sir. What can I do for you? We have a situation that could use your particular expertise. High-value extraction, hostile territory, minimal official support. Interested, Derek looked around his kitchen. Tyler's artwork on the refrigerator, soccer trophies on the windowsill, the kind of normal family chaos that had once seemed impossible. I appreciate the offer, Colonel, but I'm out. Permanently. Derek, this is important. National security implications, American civilians in danger. There are other people who can handle national security, sir. There's only one person who can handle Tyler's soccer practice. Derek ended the call and deleted the number. 6 months ago, he might have been tempted. The call of duty died hard in men who'd made it their entire identity. But Derek had learned something important over the past year. Duty wasn't just about serving your country. Sometimes duty meant being present for the people who needed you most. That afternoon, Derek arrived at Tyler's soccer practice 15 minutes early. He'd learned that other parents appreciated punctuality and that being the reliable dad made Tyler proud in ways that military decorations never could. Derek watched his son play with the kind of focused attention he'd once reserved for tactical analysis. Tyler had inherited Derek's ability to assess situations quickly and his refusal to be intimidated by larger opponents. But more importantly, Tyler had developed the kind of easy confidence that came from children who knew they were supported unconditionally. Derek Morrison? Derek turned to find a woman about his age approaching the bleachers. She was attractive in an understated way, the kind of beauty that came from competence and confidence rather than careful artifice. I'm Janet Stevens. My daughter Emma is on Tyler's team. Derek nodded politely. Nice to meet you. Janet sat down beside him on the bleachers. Tyler talks about you a lot during practice. It's clear he thinks you're pretty amazing. Derek watched Tyler successfully steal the ball from a much larger opponent. He's a good kid. He is. And you're doing a great job with him. Janet's voice carried the authority of someone who'd seen enough families to recognize functional ones. I'm a family therapist, and I see a lot of children from difficult situations. Tyler has adapted remarkably well. Derek studied Janet's face, looking for the signs of professional curiosity or therapeutic agenda that he'd learned to recognize. Instead, he saw genuine warmth and the kind of careful observation that came from people who cared about children's welfare. Tyler's been through some challenges, Derek said carefully. Most kids have. The difference is whether they have someone who gives them stability afterward. Janet watched Tyler score a goal and pump his fist in celebration. He's lucky to have you. Derek found himself genuinely enjoying the conversation. Janet was intelligent without being academic, observant without being intrusive, and she clearly understood the difference between professional interest and personal connection. After practice, Tyler ran over to Derek with the kind of exuberant energy that came from 9-year-olds who'd spent an hour chasing a ball around a field. Did you see my goal, Dad? I saw it. Nice footwork. Tyler beamed, then noticed Janet standing nearby. Hi, Mrs. Stevens. Did you see Emma's save in the second half? She's really good. She is, Janet agreed. And your goal was pretty impressive, too. Tyler's grin widened. Derek had noticed that his son responded well to adult approval, probably because he'd spent too much time with adults who withheld it as a form of control. Mrs. Stevens, Tyler said with the kind of thoughtful seriousness that made Derek proud. Do you and Emma want to get ice cream with us? Dad always buys ice cream after practice. Derek looked at Janet, who was clearly amused by Tyler's direct approach to social arrangements. If your dad doesn't mind the company, she said. Derek found himself saying, "We'd enjoy the company." An hour later, Derek sat in a local ice cream shop watching Tyler and Emma engage in the kind of intense conversation that 9-year-olds had about important topics like favorite flavors and whether soccer was better than baseball. "He's a remarkable kid," Janet said quietly. "Confident but not arrogant, friendly but not naive. Whatever he went through before, he's clearly come out stronger." Derek nodded. "Tyler has good instincts about people. He's learned to trust his judgment." Janet smiled. "That's a valuable skill. Too many children learn to doubt themselves when adults fail them." Derek found himself opening up in ways that surprised him. Tyler's mother. She made some choices that weren't in his best interest. He's had to learn that not all adults are trustworthy. But he trusts you completely. "I hope so. I've tried to be consistent, predictable. After what he went through, he needed to know that some things were permanent." Janet's expression grew thoughtful. "You know, most single fathers in your situation would have remarried quickly just to provide a mother figure. The fact that you didn't suggests you understand that stability is more important than conventional family structure." Derek considered this. "Tyler and I are a family. We don't need to add people to be complete. But you're open to adding people if they enhance what you already have." Derek looked at Janet with new appreciation. She was asking direct questions without being intrusive, showing interest without being pushy. "I'm open to possibilities." Janet's smile was warm and genuine. "Good, because Emma and I are pretty good at enhancing things." As they walked back to their cars, Tyler chatted excitedly about the upcoming game schedule and whether Derek thought he was ready to try out for the traveling team. Derek listened with the kind of focused attention that told Tyler his interests mattered, his dreams were valid, and his father would support whatever he chose to pursue. "Dad," Tyler said as they reached their Jeep, "I like Mrs. Stevens and Emma. They're nice." Derek buckled Tyler into his seat and considered his son's assessment. Tyler had become an excellent judge of character, partly because of what he'd experienced, partly because Derek had taught him to trust his instincts. "I like them too, son." That evening, after Tyler was asleep, Derek sat on his back porch and reflected on the day. A year ago, he'd been planning the systematic destruction of people who'd threatened his family. Tonight, he was thinking about soccer practices and ice cream dates and the possibility of expanding his definition of family to include people who enhanced rather than threatened what he'd built. Derek Morrison had spent 22 years in a profession where victory meant eliminating enemies and success was measured in missions completed. Now he was learning that the most important victories were quiet ones. A son who laughed easily, bedtime routines that felt like tradition rather than obligation, and the possibility of building something new without forgetting the importance of protecting what already existed. Derek looked up at stars that seemed brighter than they had a year ago and smiled. Tomorrow Tyler had a science test, soccer practice, and a play date with Emma Stevens. Next week, there was a parent-teacher conference and a school carnival where Derek would probably get talked into working the dunking booth. It was, Derek reflected, exactly the kind of future worth